She was 22 years old when she married into the most powerful family in America. She was 45 when she finally left it. And in the 23 years between those two moments, she lost more than most people will ever be asked to lose. She lost pregnancies that she was never permitted to grieve publicly. She lost her sense of self inside a marriage that had no real interest in who she was, beyond what she could contribute to the larger project of Kennedy greatness. She lost her health. She lost years. She lost the quiet life she might have built around music and warmth and the kind of ordinary human connection that turns out to matter more than any amount of glamour or political power. And for a long time, it looked like she might lose everything, but she did not. And that is the part of Joan Kennedy's story that nobody ever leads with. Not the losing, the surviving. The slow, unglamorous, deeply private work of rebuilding a life from the ground up at an age when most people assume a woman's story is already finished. Joan Kennedy's story was not finished. Not by a long way. Welcome to another educational video on the history of the elites. If this is your first time here, comment below where you're watching from, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our future videos. To understand Joan Kennedy, you have to go back to before the Kennedy name, before the Senate campaigns and the scandal and the heartbreak. You have to go back to a quiet, wealthy suburb just north of New York City, and to a girl who wanted nothing more complicated than to play the piano and live a graceful life. Joan Bennett was born on September 2nd, 1936 in Bronxville, New York. Bronxville is the kind of place where old money lives quietly and respectably. The houses are large but understated. The churches are full on Sundays. The children are raised with clear expectations about conduct, presentation, and the importance of never making a scene. Her father, Harry Wiggin Bennett Jr., worked in advertising. He was a capable and well-regarded man who believed in hard work, good manners, and keeping up appearances. Her mother, Virginia Joan Stead, was a woman for whom composure was not just a preference but a discipline. The Bennett household was not cold exactly, but it was controlled. Feelings were managed rather than expressed. You did not burden other people with your interior life. You composed yourself and you carried on. Joan absorbed those lessons the way children absorb everything in the homes they grow up in, not just through what was said, but through the texture of daily life, through watching how her parents moved through the world and what they rewarded and what they quietly discouraged. She became a girl who was gentle and eager to please and deeply reluctant to cause discomfort to anyone around her. Those qualities would follow her for the rest of her life. In the years ahead, they would be both her greatest strength and the thing that made her so easy to take advantage of. She was also, from a very young age, genuinely beautiful. Tall and blonde with a natural elegance that drew attention without any effort on her part. But beauty was never the thing Joan valued most about herself. What she valued was music. She began playing the piano as a young child and discovered quickly that she was gifted, not just technically capable, but emotionally connected to music in a way that went beyond what could be taught or practiced. When Joan sat at a piano, something shifted in her. The careful and composed girl that her upbringing had produced seemed to dissolve, and something more open, more feeling, more fully alive took her place. Music was the one space where Joan Bennett did not have to manage herself, where she could simply feel whatever she felt without consequence. It is worth holding on to that detail because in the years ahead, it would matter more than anyone around her seemed to understand. After high school, she enrolled at the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in Purchase, New York. It was a small and prestigious Catholic women's college that had a particular reputation for producing women of grace, poise, and social accomplishment. As it happened, it had also educated several Kennedy women, including Ethel Skakel, who would go on to marry Robert Kennedy. The college shaped its students toward composure, toward duty, toward a version of womanhood that was deeply intertwined with service and presentation. Joan thrived there. She was popular and warm and genuinely liked by almost everyone around her. She was elected to the homecoming court. She was involved in campus life. She was the kind of young woman who made friends easily and kept them. She carried with her an openness, a readiness to trust the world and the people in it that would, in the years ahead, be tested in ways she could not have anticipated. It was during her senior year, in October 1957, that everything changed. Ted Kennedy's sister, Jean Kennedy Smith, introduced her to a young man at a campus dedication ceremony. It was the kind of ordinary institutional event that gets forgotten within a week. Except that this one would alter the entire course of Joan Bennett's life. His name was Edward Moore Kennedy. The world would come to know him simply as Ted. He was 25 years old, the youngest of 9 children born to Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. and his wife, Rose. He had grown up in a world of extraordinary privilege, surrounded by siblings who were brilliant and fiercely competitive, and driven by an ambition that their father had spent decades deliberately cultivating. Ted had the looks, the charm, and the full weight of one of the most powerful dynasties in American political history behind him. He was the kind of young man who filled a room without trying. When Ted met Joan at that campus ceremony in October 1957, he pursued her with the full and deliberate force of the Kennedy charm. He was confident and persistent and very difficult to ignore. Joan was 21 years old and she was dazzled. Her parents approved enthusiastically. The Kennedys were Catholic, prosperous, politically prominent, and socially impeccable. From the outside, from the perspective of a Bronxville family in the late 1950s, this looked like the best possible future a young woman of her background could hope for. They were married on November 29, 1958, at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Bronxville. The wedding was elegant and proper and covered extensively in the press.
In that direction.
Joan and I were married on the 29th of November.
I was 4 years old, and I think Ted was 8. And we lived 2 blocks apart, and we never met until I was in college.
Virginia Joan Bennett.
For my lawful wife.
For my lawful wife.
This was obviously one of the great happy moments. It seemed that everything was coming up roses.
Joan wore a gown with a long, flowing train. She looked, as all the newspaper accounts noted with near unanimous agreement, absolutely radiant. And she probably was. She was 22 years old and in love, and she had no reason yet to be anything other than radiant. She had no idea what she was walking into. She could not have known. And the story of what came next is not simply the story of a difficult marriage. It is the story of what happens when a person of genuine sensitivity and feeling is placed inside a world that has no room for either. Within 2 years of the wedding, her brother-in-law, John F. Kennedy, was elected the 35th President of the United States. The Kennedys were no longer just a powerful family. They were American royalty. They were Camelot. And Joan was now part of that story, whether she was fully ready for it or not. She attended White House dinners. She appeared at campaign events. She was photographed alongside Jackie Kennedy, the most famous woman in the world at that time. And the comparison was inevitable. 2 beautiful Kennedy wives. 2 women who had married into something much larger than themselves. But where Jackie seemed to thrive in the spotlight, to command it with a particular cool authority, Joan struggled. She was shy by nature. She was not a natural politician. She preferred a quiet evening at the piano to a room full of cameras and political small talk. But quiet evenings were not something Kennedy wives were permitted very often. Being a Kennedy wife came with a very specific and unspoken set of rules. Rose Kennedy, the family matriarch, had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of being a Kennedy woman. She was devout and disciplined and immovable in her expectations. The women who married into the family were expected to be supportive and presentable and strong. They were expected to stand beside their husbands through anything and smile while doing it. Private pain was private. Public composure was non-negotiable. Joan tried to fit that mold. She genuinely tried. In 1962, Ted Kennedy ran for the United States Senate, competing for the seat his brother John had vacated when he became president. Joan threw herself into the campaign. She traveled. She spoke at events. She shook hands and smiled for thousands of photographs. Ted won. And Joan became a senator's wife, a role that came with its own exhausting and relentless set of performances. but the performance was taking a toll that nobody around her seemed particularly interested in acknowledging. Inside the marriage, things were not what they appeared from the outside. Ted Kennedy was not a faithful husband. He had relationships with other women throughout their marriage, some brief and some more prolonged, and almost none of them kept particularly secret within the circles the Kennedys moved in. Joan knew. She was not protected from knowing. And the expectation of the world around her, the family, the culture, the unspoken architecture of the era she inhabited, was that she would absorb this and continue, that she would carry it privately and not let it disrupt the larger picture. She was not built for that kind of silence. She was too sensitive, too genuinely wounded by the things that wounded her. The gap between what she felt and what she was permitted to express began to accumulate in ways that are, in retrospect, entirely predictable and entirely heartbreaking. She channeled what she could into motherhood. In February 1960, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Cara Ann Kennedy. In September 1961, their son Edward Moore Kennedy Jr. arrived. In July 1967, their third child, Patrick Joseph Kennedy II, was born. Joan adored her children with a depth and devotion that everyone who knew the family described consistently as one of the most genuine and uncomplicated things about her. Motherhood was not a performance for Joan. It was a real and sustaining source of love, in a life where real and sustaining sources of love were becoming increasingly hard to find. But even motherhood came with its share of heartbreak. Joan suffered multiple miscarriages during her marriage, losses that were deeply painful and deeply personal, and that she largely had to grieve in silence, without public acknowledgement, without the kind of communal support that such losses deserve. Each one was absorbed into the larger silence that defined her emotional life within the marriage. Each one added weight to a load that was already becoming very difficult to carry. She had begun drinking more heavily. It did not happen all at once. It rarely does. It started as a way to get through difficult evenings and difficult events and difficult feelings that had nowhere else to go. In a social world where alcohol was everywhere and where everyone around her was drinking, it was easy for the escalation to go unnoticed. Or for the people who noticed to say nothing, because saying something would have meant acknowledging that something was wrong. And acknowledging that something was wrong was not something the Kennedy world did easily or willingly. The 1960s were for the Kennedy family a decade of extraordinary public triumph and devastating private loss. And Joan lived through all of it from the inside, with no real buffer between herself and the full force of what kept happening. When John Kennedy was inaugurated as president in January 1961, Joan was 24 years old, standing at the edge of a moment that the country experienced as something close to magic. She was part of that tableau, dressed beautifully and performing perfectly, as she always was. Then, in November 1963, President Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas. For most Americans, that was a national trauma experienced through television screens and newspaper headlines. For Joan, it happened in the room. She was part of the family that had to stand at the casket and hold itself together for the entire country to witness. She was 27 years old with 3 small children, and she was expected, as all the Kennedy women were expected, to bear it with a composure that had nothing to do with how she actually felt. In June 1964, Ted was severely injured in a plane crash in West Massachusetts that killed the pilot and a Kennedy aide. He was hospitalized for months with a broken back, a punctured lung, and broken ribs. While he recovered, Joan stepped forward to keep his Senate campaign alive, appearing at events on his behalf, traveling, speaking, doing what needed to be done. She did this while raising 3 young children and managing a household and carrying the private weight of a marriage that was already costing her more than anyone around her seemed to notice or care about. Then in June 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles, moments after winning the California Democratic presidential primary. Another Kennedy, another public murder. Another period of national mourning that the family was expected to lead with visible grace and strength. Joan stood in the photographs that went around the world. She wore black and kept her face composed and did what was required of her. But inside, by every account of people who knew her during this period, she was being ground down in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The grief was real. The fear was real. The exhaustion of living inside a family where tragedy seemed to reach in from the outside world on a regular basis was real. And there was no structure within her marriage or within the family that was equipped or willing to help her process any of it. On the night of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy attended a small party on Chappaquiddick Island off the coast of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. The gathering included several men connected to the Kennedy political world and 6 young women who had worked on Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign. One of those women was a 28-year-old named Mary Jo Kopechne from Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, who had been deeply devoted to Robert Kennedy's vision for the country. Late that night, Ted left the party with Mary Jo. He was driving. On a dark road near a narrow wooden bridge called Dyke Bridge, the car went off the edge and plunged into the water below. Ted Kennedy survived. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. What happened in the hours that followed has been examined and debated and condemned for more than 5 decades. Ted did not immediately report the accident to the authorities. He left the scene. Hours passed before a call was made. Mary Jo's body was found in the submerged car the following morning. Evidence indicated that she had survived in an air pocket after the crash. The question of whether she might have lived if help had come sooner has never gone away, and it never will. Ted Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. He received a suspended sentence. No charges were ever brought in relation to Mary Jo Kopechne's death. The Kennedy political apparatus mobilized with extraordinary speed to contain the damage. Ted gave a televised address to the people of Massachusetts. He stayed in the Senate. Joan was not at the party that night. She had been at home, confined to bed, pregnant, and already carrying the physical toll of previous miscarriages. When the news broke, she was called to play her part in the response. She appeared publicly beside Ted in the days that followed, composed, supportive. The picture of a wife standing by her husband. She suffered another miscarriage shortly after. Sit with that for a moment. Joan Kennedy was pregnant. She was already carrying the private weight of a marriage that had been quietly breaking for years. And she was being asked to stand in front of the entire world and publicly support her husband in the aftermath of an event that had cost a young woman her life. A young woman who was 28 years old and had her whole life in front of her. Joan did it because she had been trained from the time she was a little girl in Bronxville to hold herself together regardless of what was happening underneath. Because that was what was expected. Because that was what Kennedy wives did. But something broke inside her that year. Something that would not fully heal. Her drinking worsened significantly in the years that followed Chappaquiddick. She sought help. She entered treatment programs more than once. She had periods of sobriety that held for a while and then fractured under the weight of a life that continued to demand more from her than it gave back. Every stumble was documented by the press with a merciless enthusiasm that is genuinely painful to look back on today. The woman who had once graced magazine covers was now the subject of tabloid gossip. The senator's beautiful wife had become, in the eyes of the media, a cautionary tale. But they were telling the wrong story. And they knew it. They just didn't care. In the middle of all of this, something happened that tends to get buried beneath the more dramatic headlines of the Kennedy story. Something that reveals more about who Joan Kennedy actually was than almost anything else in her life. In 1973, her son Edward Moore Kennedy Jr., 12 years old at the time, was diagnosed with chondrosarcoma. It is a rare and aggressive form of bone cancer. The cancer was located in his right leg. Doctors determined that the leg would need to be amputated just below the knee in order to save his life. Ted Jr. was 12 years old. He underwent the amputation, and then he underwent months of experimental chemotherapy treatment that was grueling in ways that are difficult to describe. The side effects were severe. He was in significant and sustained pain. He was a child navigating something that would have broken most adults. And Joan was there, through all of it. Whatever was happening in her own life, whatever private battles she was fighting, she was at her son's side, with a presence and a devotion that everyone who witnessed it described as fierce and unwavering. Ted Jr. has spoken about this period publicly in the years since. He has described a particular moment that has stayed with him his entire life. It was a winter evening during his recovery. He and his father were outside walking up an icy driveway. He slipped on the ice and struggled to get back up and began to cry from the pain and the frustration and the sheer accumulated weight of everything his young body was being asked to endure. His father stood and watched. His father did not go to him, it was Joan who came. That single image says something about the texture of that family and about Joan's place within it that no amount of political biography ever quite manages to capture. She was, at her core and above everything else, a mother, even when she herself was barely holding together, even when the demands on her were impossible. She showed up for her children in ways that the more celebrated members of that family sometimes did not. Ted Jr. survived. He went on to graduate from Yale University and Yale Law School. He became a Connecticut state senator and a prominent and effective advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. He has spoken throughout his adult life about the role his mother's love played in shaping who he became, about how her presence during those brutal months of treatment gave him something he carried forward into everything that followed. That story deserves to be told alongside every other story about Joan Kennedy. It deserves to be the first thing people mention when her name comes up, because it is the truest thing about her. By the late 1970s, Ted Kennedy had become one of the most powerful and recognizable figures in American political life. He had served Massachusetts in the Senate for nearly 2 decades and had built a reputation as one of the most effective legislators of his generation. As President Jimmy Carter's administration struggled through economic difficulty and the Iran hostage crisis, pressure mounted within the Democratic Party for Ted to challenge him for the presidential nomination. Ted announced his candidacy in late 1979, and Joan, despite everything, agreed to campaign for him. She has spoken about this decision in various interviews over the years. Her explanation is both simple and quietly devastating. She wanted to help. She believed in his ability to lead the country. She had spent so many years being part of something larger than herself that, stepping away from it entirely felt, in some complicated way, impossible. And there may have been something else underneath it too. Some faint and fragile hope that shared purpose might restore something between them. That standing together for one more important thing might matter. What happened instead was one of the most publicly exposing and painful experiences of her life. She campaigned actively. She gave speeches. She appeared at events across the country. And she did something that was genuinely remarkable for a political spouse of that era. She spoke openly and honestly in interviews about her struggle with alcoholism. She framed it in terms of recovery and resilience. She did not hide from it or deflect. She looked into cameras and told the truth about something that most people in her position would have kept carefully concealed. Many people responded to that honesty with genuine warmth and respect. For a brief and extraordinary moment, Joan Kennedy stepped out of the shadow of the Kennedy name and was seen as a person in her own right, a woman with her own story, her own voice, her own hard-won understanding of what she had been through. But the scrutiny was relentless, and it was rarely generous. Every appearance was analysed. Every photograph was studied. When she looked tired, it was doted. When she misspoke, it was amplified and repeated. The press that had spent years largely ignoring Joan Kennedy had suddenly developed an appetite for her, and the story they had already decided to tell was not a kind one. Ted Kennedy did not win the Democratic presidential primary. Jimmy Carter held the nomination and went on to lose the general election to Ronald Reagan. The campaign ended, and shortly after, so did the marriage. They separated, and the divorce was finalized in 1982, after nearly 24 years together. Joan was 45 years old. She had spent her entire adult life inside the Kennedy world. She had given it her beauty and her composure, and her silence and her children and her health, and very nearly everything she had. And now she was outside of it. Alone, starting from the beginning in a way that very few people are ever asked to do at the age of 45. Ted Kennedy moved on. He remarried in 1992 to a woman named Victoria Reggie and rebuilt his public image in the years that followed. His later years in the Senate were widely regarded as his most productive and his most admirable. History has been generous to Ted Kennedy. For Joan, the path forward was lonelier and considerably slower. The years after the divorce were a long and complicated process of trying to build something that was genuinely and entirely her own. She had never truly lived as an independent adult. She had gone from her parents' home to a college dormitory to a Kennedy household. The transition into a life governed only by her own choices was significant, and it was hard. She moved into a condominium in Boston. It was the first home she had ever occupied entirely on her own terms. She enrolled at Lesley College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she studied music education. It was a return to the things she had loved before any of the rest of it had begun. The piano, the music, the part of herself that had existed before she became a Kennedy wife. She completed her master's degree quietly and without fanfare. It was a genuine accomplishment that received almost no public attention, which is perhaps fitting, because it was one of the first things she had done entirely for herself. In 1992, she published a book called The Joy of Classical Music, a guide for you and your family. It was warm and knowledgeable and reflected the genuine musical passion she had carried her whole life. It was also, in its quiet way, a statement. There was a Joan Kennedy who existed beyond the marriage and beyond the Kennedys and beyond the tragedy. A woman with something real to contribute, something that was hers alone. But the challenges continued. The sobriety she worked toward in the years after the divorce did not hold consistently. She cycled through periods of recovery and relapse. In 1992, she was involved in a minor car accident in Boston. In 1994, she was found outside in the cold, confused and disoriented. And the incident attracted exactly the kind of press coverage that reduced her once again to the same tired shorthand. Ted Kennedy's troubled ex-wife, the woman who couldn't hold it together. It was, as it had always been, a profoundly incomplete picture of who she was. What those headlines never captured was the woman her children knew. The woman who showed up. The woman who called and remembered and cared and fought through her own considerable difficulties to remain present in the lives of the people she loved most in the world. Ted Kennedy died in August 2009 after a battle with brain cancer. He was 77 years old. Whatever the complexities of everything that had passed between them across more than 2 decades of marriage, Joan attended his memorial services. She sat among the Kennedys one more time. The photographs from those services show her older and quieter but composed, as she had always been composed in public, as she had been trained from childhood to be. Then in September 2011, Cara Kennedy, Joan's eldest child and only daughter, died of a heart attack at the age of 51. She collapsed at a gym in Washington after completing a workout. She had a history of cardiac problems following treatment for lung cancer years earlier. She was gone before help could reach her. The death of a child is a grief from which a parent does not simply recover. There is no resolution to it, and no timeline, and no amount of strength or faith or time that makes it fully bearable. Joan carried that loss in the years that followed with the same quiet endurance she had brought to every other loss in her life. She was private about it. She did not perform her grief for an audience. She simply lived with it, the way you live with something that becomes part of the permanent landscape of who you are. Patrick Kennedy, her youngest child, has spoken about his mother in the years since with tremendous love and with a frankness that cuts through the easy and reductive narratives. He has described a woman who was dealing with things that the family and the world around her were never properly equipped to address. A woman whose struggles were too often treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. He has spoken about the failure of support, about the ways in which the systems that surrounded her, the family, the political world, the culture of the era, were simply not built to hold someone like Joan with the care and the seriousness she deserved. He is right, and it matters that he said it.
Right, we're turning right.
Joan Kennedy passed away on October 8, 2025, at the age of 89. She died quietly, without the nationally televised memorial or the flood of political tributes that tend to surround the deaths of the more prominent Kennedys. The coverage was respectful but brief. A few obituaries, a few recollections from people who had known her. And then the world moved on in the way that it always moves on from the women who stood at the edges of great men's stories. But before it does entirely, it is worth sitting with who she actually was, what her life actually cost her, and what she actually managed to build out of the wreckage of a marriage and an era that were both, in their own ways, designed to consume her completely. In her later years, Joan was quieter and more private. Boston was her home. Music was still her anchor. She walked along the Charles River. She played the piano. She lived a life that was, however belatedly, genuinely and entirely her own. The people who knew her in those final years described a woman who had found something that had eluded her for most of her adult life. A kind of peace, hard-won and real, and belonging only to her. Joan Kennedy's story is not a simple story. It does not fit neatly into a single category, and it does not resolve cleanly into a lesson. She was not just a victim. She was not just a survivor. She was not just a Kennedy wife or an alcoholic or a socialite or a tragic figure. She was a woman. A fully complicated and fully human woman who was handed a life of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary pain, very often at the exact same time, and who did not always handle it perfectly, because she was a person and not a symbol, and people are not required to handle impossible things perfectly. Her struggles with alcohol were real. There is no reason to minimize them, but they did not come from nowhere. They came from years of living inside a structure that gave her almost no permission to be honest about what she was actually experiencing. Years of miscarriages grieved in silence. Years of infidelity absorbed without acknowledgment. Years of grief piled on grief without adequate space to process any of it. Years of being asked again and again to perform a version of herself that had less and less to do with who she actually was. The Kennedy world was not designed with Joan's humanity in mind. It was designed around a project of power and legacy and political ambition. And Joan was a person, not a piece of a project. That mismatch was the source of almost everything that followed. And the weight of that mismatch was placed almost entirely on her. The people who knew Joan best have consistently described someone warmer and funnier, and more intelligent and more self-aware than her public image ever captured. A woman who read widely, who adored her children with an uncomplicated fierceness, who could sit down at a piano and play Chopin from memory and talk about it afterward with genuine and infectious passion, who, even in the most difficult periods of her life, was visibly and earnestly trying to find her footing and keep it. She never fully disappeared into her struggles, even when the press coverage made it seem like she had. She kept showing up, to her children's lives, to family events, to the slow and unglamorous work of trying to understand herself and rebuild herself on better terms. She kept going. And that part, the part where she just kept going, tends to get completely lost in the telling. There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens to women like Joan Kennedy. It is not the forgetting of absence. She was never invisible. She was photographed constantly and written about periodically and discussed in connection to the Kennedy legacy in ways that will probably continue for as long as that legacy is discussed at all. The forgetting is more specific than that. It is the forgetting of the actual person beneath the image, the loss of the interior life, the erasure of all the texture and complexity and feeling that made her a human being rather than a symbol. What history has tended to preserve about Joan Kennedy is largely defined by three things: her beauty, her marriage, and her struggles. Those three things taken together form a narrative that is easy to package and easy to repeat. The golden Kennedy wife who fell apart, the cautionary tale, the blonde at the edge of every photograph who ended up, in the end, left behind. That narrative is not entirely false, but it is profoundly and inexcusably incomplete. And its incompleteness says something not only about Joan, but about how the culture that surrounded her understood and valued women in general. She deserved better from the family she married into. She deserved better from the press that covered her. She deserved better from the era she lived through. an era that asked women to be beautiful and silent and endlessly accommodating, and then judged them harshly when the weight of all that beauty and silence and accommodation finally became more than one person could carry. And she deserved better from the history that recorded her life primarily as a side chapter in someone else's biography. The least we can do now, this far down the road, is look at that photograph again. The one where she is standing at the edge of the frame, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, wearing that smile that never quite reaches her eyes. And this time, instead of looking past her toward the more famous faces at the center of the frame, we stop. We look at her. We actually see her. Not Ted Kennedy's wife, not the troubled blonde, not the cautionary tale, not the woman who couldn't handle the pressure. Joan Bennett, the girl from Bronxville who loved music and felt things deeply and walked into a life she could not fully see from the doorstep and kept going anyway, through more than most people will ever be asked to endure. And who found in the quiet years at the end of a long and difficult life something that looked very much like peace. She kept going. And that, in the end, is the part of her story that deserves to be remembered the longest. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every day we tell the stories of women whose lives were far bigger than the space history gave them. We will see you in the next one.